Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Caleb. I'm one of the pastors here. Would love to meet you if I have not met you already. Thank you for spending your Mother's Day with us, and thank you to all you moms who are discipling your children. We are so appreciative of that. And today, we're going to be continuing our Mark series. And as I was thinking about this week's passage for us, we've got a shorter passage, only about 5 verses or so. But as I was thinking about the passage, I was reminded of the movie The Matrix, okay? Very Mother's Day themed movie choice, right? But that's what I was reminded of as I was reading it, okay? And so if you haven't seen The Matrix, there's this main character named Neo, and he is just living a regular, average, early 2000s, late 90s life, working an office job. And he is not really satisfied with his friendships or his work or anything in his life. He feels like he's missing something. He thinks there's something greater out there for him, but he doesn't quite know what it is. And it's not until he meets this guy named Morpheus, and he has all these experiences, takes a red pill, the classic meme type situation there. And after that, he realizes that he was not seeing the real world at all, but he was just in an illusion. So despite the fact that the real world was right in front of his face, he could not see it because he was deceived by the Matrix, right? He could not see it. And that's what we're going to see in our passage today, that there are multiple characters that are right in front of Jesus. They have all these experiences with Jesus, but they cannot see the reality of Jesus right in front of their faces. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, the unawareness of people to the greatness of who Jesus is. So with that as an introduction, we're going to be in Mark chapter 8 today. So if you have not turned there, go ahead and turn there in your Bibles, and that's where we'll be camping out in Mark chapter 8. And as you turn there, just a reminder of what we talked about last week, because it's important to what we're talking about today. Last week, Brian talked about the feeding of the 4,000, not the 5,000, the 4,000, where Jesus miraculously healed these thousands of people with a meal for a couple people. And then he talked about how the Pharisees doubted who Jesus said he was and his teachings. And he ended on the fact that despite seeing all these amazing things, the disciples still did not understand the reality of who Jesus is. And so on the tail of that is where we're going to be jumping into Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 22. So that's where we'll be, Mark 8, verse 22. And here's what it says. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. And he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And that is our passage for today. So today, one of our main characters is this blind man. All right, and in our modern world, we tend to overlook some of the realities that people with ailments or certain disabilities would have in the ancient world because they don't have a lot of the modern amenities and resources that we have today. Not to say it's not hard if that's your situation now, but we have more resources and more things to go to. All right, and so in the ancient world, you couldn't go to the optometrist, you couldn't go to the ophthalmologist and just say, "Hey, what's wrong with my eyes? What's going on here?" They just didn't have that type of thing. And in Jesus' day, they would try to apply all sorts of weird concoctions. So if you look into some of the background stuff, it's like, oh, we'll mix chicken blood with this other stuff and then put it in your eyes, and you're like, how does that make sense, right? But that's what they did because they didn't know about germs and they didn't know about diseases or any of these things, right? And so, they didn't have the ability to perform surgeries or anything like that. And so a lot of these concoctions just made things worse for those who were already in a difficult spot. And this blind man, it seems that he at once could see, but then eventually lost his sight. Mark tells us the man's sight was restored, implying that at one point he could actually see, and then he lost it due to cataracts or glaucoma or something like that. We don't really know for sure. But we know that there is not a medical solution for him at the time to restore his sight. So there's no medical hope to regain his vision. And we also know at this time that if you had an ailment, a lot of times people would tie that to your spiritual status. Okay, so an unfortunate reality of the ancient world was that oftentimes if you had an ailment or you had a disability, they would say that's because of your sin or that's because of your parents' sin. And that's just not true. Okay, but that's what they would do in this culture. Right, and so we know that's not the case. Right, in John 9, we see that Jesus heals this man with a disability, and the people ask him, is it his sin or his parents' sin? And he says, that's basically not the reality, okay? We also see this in Job. Job's friends, if you want to call him that, say that, he had all these bad things happen to him because of his sin, when that wasn't the reality. Okay? So this is a common thing in Judaism at the time, that your sin was directly tied to any ailments or anything like that. Okay? And so if it's not enough that, he already was blind, there's also some social ostracization happening to him as well. But thankfully, this man's experience is that he has some really good friends around him, right? He has friends that will take him to Jesus, right? They're willing to guide him to Jesus so that way he can be healed. And these friends not only led this man to Jesus, but they were willing to advocate for him, right? They begged Jesus to heal him on his behalf. Right? So it's just another level of friendship if you're willing to beg for your friend. You're willing to humble yourself and come and beg and say, Jesus, please heal this man, right? Even though it doesn't necessarily benefit you in any way. That's a real loving friendship there, and it's a beautiful thing. And Jesus decides to then say, okay, I'm going to heal this man, but let's go outside the village. Which is kind of an interesting thing that he's doing here. But it reminds us of Jesus' healings back in chapter 7, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. And in chapter 7, Jesus heals a man who's deaf. And there's a lot of similarities to that story, that both the healings were done in private settings. One was in a home, and this one's done in a village. Both healings involve someone else reaching out on behalf of the other person. The deaf man's friends came to Jesus. The blind man's friend come to Jesus. We also see both healings involve Jesus spitting to heal the people, which is a weird fact, but that is what it is. And finally, we see the command to keep quiet or stay out of the village, kind of a secrecy command from Jesus. So we're seeing a lot of parallels between 7:31 to 37 and Mark chapter 8 here. So there's a lot of parallels. It kind of forms like a unit, a mirror of the two events for us to mark this unit. And Jesus taking this man out of the village is essentially him healing him on his own terms, right? He doesn't heal this man simply because these people asked, but because he wanted to heal this man. Right? It's a wonderful thing to beg for Jesus' healing here, but Jesus decides to heal this man ultimately because it's his prerogative. Right? And going to a secluded place shows us Jesus isn't just about his fame and notoriety, but he wants to heal this man, and it's more of a private, intimate moment than it would be if he did it in front of a large crowd. But one thing that really stands out about this healing is it's just a little bit different than the other ones in Mark. That it kind of happens in two stages, right? Jesus puts his hands on this man, and then he asks him, can you see? The man is kind of like half healed, and he sees like these weird tree-like figures. And then Jesus puts his hands on him again, and then he can see clearly. Which is really strange, because most of the time Jesus either just says a word or he just touches them and then they're instantly healed. So this is a very unique healing in all of Mark, right? I think it's the only time, in fact, that there's two stages to Jesus' healing. And so we must ask the question, is it unsuccessful, or why did Jesus not heal him instantly? What's the reason here? And so there's really two routes we could go. We could say, well, does Jesus have enough power to heal this man? And if we've read Mark up to this point, we've seen that Jesus can control the weather with his words. We've seen that Jesus can feed thousands of people with just a few loaves and fish. We've seen Jesus can exorcise demons from not even being in the same room as another person. So it really seems like power is not the issue for Jesus here. So it can't be that. And then the next question is, well, is it a process thing? Does Jesus just not do the healing correctly? And in response to this, we have to ask, well, Jesus seems to heal and do all these miracles in many different ways. So it's hard to believe that someone who can just speak and the weather changes can't just decide how they want to heal this person. That just seems like a strange argument to make and not necessarily the most logical. So if it's not a power and it's not a process issue, what is it? And I think the most logical thing is that Jesus wanted to do it in two stages, that he is intentionally doing it to communicate something to us as Mark's readers and to his disciples who are there watching. Right? Because remember, he's in the village, and maybe this man's friends are around, but it's really only the disciples who are there with him. So there's an intentionality to why Jesus is doing this. So what's the intentional thing? And I think it's the question Jesus asks between the two laying on of hands. And Jesus asks, can you see? Right? He asks, can you see? And this reminds us of after the healing of the 4,000 last week, Jesus said to the disciples, having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear, and do you not remember? Right? Jesus is again in our passage today asking about sight. Does this man see? And so I think this is a callback to Jesus' interaction with the disciples after the healing of the 4,000, and they just really don't get it. They don't understand. They don't see the fullness of who Jesus is. And so Mark is using this to ask a broader theological question to us as the reader. Do we see Jesus for who he is, or are we missing some of the picture? That's what Mark is asking us, right? That the disciples have some level of understanding of who Jesus is, but they really don't understand his mission up to this point, right? That the disciples are blinded by their assumptions of who Jesus should be, and so they cannot see the reality of the teaching and the miracles that have happened all along. And in this vein, our section today acts as a turning point in all of Mark. That we're starting to go into a new section where the disciples are going to hear Jesus teach about how he must die and come back to life again. And then they will respond with, no, Jesus, that's not the plan, right? Which is just a wild thing to say to Jesus, right? But that's what they do consistently. And it shows us that they don't get the picture yet. They don't understand how Jesus' mission is supposed to happen. And our passage today is foreshadowing that, leading us into this new section. Right? And we also see this geographically, too, in this section, that Jesus is in Bethsaida, or literally the house of the fishermen. So this is the end of his Galilean ministry. But we also see this in the allusion to further passages in Mark. And our passage leading into this new section ends with Jesus healing this man and sending him back home, but not through the village they started in. And I think the obvious reason why Jesus wants this is so that way he doesn't get mobbed by all the people who would want to either be healed by him or want to hear part of his teaching, right? That's what's been happening. So it's just probably more of not getting mobbed and also probably not seeking more controversy. And that's how this transitional passage ends for us. But as we reflect on this passage, we should ask the question, what is Jesus trying to tell us today, right? If he's trying to show the disciples they don't see, how does that affect us in our lives? And I think our main point of our passage today is that we need to behold Jesus. We need to behold Jesus. We need to see him for who he is. And this section in Mark 8 acts as a picture to see the greater spiritual reality of who Jesus is. That Jesus, we should see Jesus in all his glory, all his beauty, and the wonder of his mission of the gospel to come and save others, right? We need to behold him. And chapter 8 of Mark here really beats us over the head with this idea of sight, right? Mark uses 3 different Greek words to talk about sight, and he uses some of them multiple times. So he's talking about vision, sight, and he does that not from like a scientific, these are the different elements of sight type of idea, but he does it to say, this is about whether you see me for who I am or not. That's what Jesus is asking us today. Do you see me for who I am or do you not? Do you see the reality of who Jesus is? Just like we talked about with the Matrix at the beginning, right? Do we see the real world, or are we still kind of in our own desires, in our own vision of the way things should be? That's the question Jesus is asking. And the disciples are on the right track, kind of like Neo. They know there's something greater out there, but they can't quite understand the fullness of it. And that's where they are in their vision of Jesus. Do we see Jesus for who he truly is? Or are we growing in how we behold him and see him? Do we anticipate the day when we will see Jesus face to face? Okay? And seeing Jesus or seeing God is a key biblical theme that's throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And probably the most famous example of this is Exodus 33, where Moses asks God to see his face. And God says, no, you can't do that because you'll die, okay? Right? So God says no, and he doesn't say no because he's asking something bad or wrong, but he says no for his own safety, and the reality is our sin separates us from God, and we can't live in the presence of a God who is holy like our God, the one true God. And so seeing God is a good thing, but it's a tricky thing because of our sin. All right? And the irony of Mark 8 is that, and this healing, is that the disciples are actually the blind ones. That though God is right in front of them, something that Moses longed to do, they did not see him, right? Yeah, Jesus didn't come in all his glory and all his beauty, but yes, he was right there in front of them. And this is exactly what we see in John chapter 9. John chapter 9 helps flesh this out a little bit for us. It says, Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. And so Jesus in this section is urging Philip to say, I'm right in front of you. You want to see God? I am him. I am right there in front of you. Why can you not see me? If you don't believe my words, at least believe the actions that I've done. Right? And this is what we see in our passage in Mark 8, that Jesus heals this blind man to show them who he is, yet they still reject him. They still don't fully understand who he is, that he is God right in front of them. Right? That's what Jesus is saying here. At least believe the miracles. And it's just shocking to think that that could be the case, that somebody could see all the things Jesus did, that they could hear all of Jesus' teaching and spend like every day with him for years and still not believe. But that's the reality of the disciples, and that's the reality of when we see things through our own lens and not through who Jesus tells us to be. Right? So we need to behold Jesus, we need to see him for who he is. And it's something that we should look forward to when we get to see God in the future, that we get to see him face to face in the fullness of his glory. And this is something that 1 John 3 talks about, that we will see Jesus as he is when we spend eternity with him in the future. When we're in the new heavens and the new earth, we will get to see Jesus in the fullness of his glory. So even the disciples in their time saw Jesus in this body, but they didn't see the fullness of his glory, right? Because they die. But they saw a part of it. But we, as Christians who have faith in Jesus, will have the opportunity to see the fullness of God's glory and the beauty and get to behold it. And the ultimate reward of Christianity is not being saved from hell. It is getting to behold the one true God in all his beauty and majesty. That is the object that we look forward to, right? It's not wrong to say, hey, I'm free. Because I have faith in Jesus, I am not going to hell. I'm going to heaven. That's a good thing, right? But it's not the ultimate thing. The ultimate thing is beholding God in all his beauty for all eternity. And that's what we have to look forward to. That's what our prize is as Christians, that we will one day see Jesus as he is. That's our prize as Christians. That's what we need to cling to, okay? So we one day will behold our God who died for us. And that's ultimately what we have to look forward to as Christians. And so that's our first point, okay? Second thing we should ask ourselves is, are we like the Pharisees, Herod, and the disciples in how we see Jesus? So the first one's kind of the positive element. This is what we should see of who Jesus is. This is kind of the negative element, right? We don't want to see Jesus in any of these three ways. All right? And the Pharisees opposed Jesus because they're scared to lose control. All right? The Pharisees are all about control and their own way of doing things. And the Pharisees, as Brian said last week, they think they're good people. They think they're the heroes of the story, right? Nobody thinks they're the villain in the story, okay? That's just the reality of the world. They think they're good. They think they're the heroes helping the people of God get back on track and follow the law the right way. But in their self-righteousness and in their thinking that they can control the thing through their traditions, they missed that God is right in front of them, showing him who he is, right? And so we should ask the question, do I seek control in my life and refuse to see the authority of Jesus in my life, right? That's what the Pharisees' mistake is, that they don't cede control to the one true king of the universe, Jesus. So do we seek control in our lives and refuse to give Jesus authority? Second, we have Herod here, and he didn't see Jesus for who he is because of his sin. He wanted the pleasures of this world versus actually what Jesus had to offer, which is eternal joy with him in heaven. And if we remember, Herod divorced his wife, then seduced his brother's wife, married her, and then had John the Baptist killed for calling him out on it, okay? So he wanted his sin. He wanted what he wanted, and he went after it to the fullest extent. Right? And so he wanted the pleasure of the world more than he wanted Jesus. And sin can blind us to who Jesus really is. And so we should ask the question, is there anything I am not willing to give up in my life to follow Jesus? Right? Is there something you would not give up to him? You wouldn't give him authority over? Is there a sin that you just want to cling to like Herod? And finally, we come to the assumption, or the disciples here, who they didn't see Jesus because of their faulty assumptions, right? They might have thought, they knew Jesus was the Messiah. They knew he's the sent one from God to save them, but they don't really understand how his victory is going to come about. They think Jesus is going to restore this national Israel, he's going to free them from the power of Rome, and he doesn't need to die to make this happen. Right? So they don't really understand this picture, and that's what we're going to see the next several weeks, is that Jesus keeps telling them this is the plan, and they keep saying, no, it's not, right? Because their assumptions control them. They don't let Jesus tell them who he really is. And so we should ask the question, do you let the Bible dictate your theology, or are you so tied to a systematic theology or your own beliefs that you're not willing to let the words of God dictate what you believe? Right? Are you so tied to a systematic theology that you will not give up a belief or not really go with the clear reading of Scripture? Right? We should not think that we're above any of these three groups of people. We're not above the Pharisees or Herod or the disciples. We too can be pulled into these ways of seeing Jesus, so we should be on guard against them. All right? So that's our second point. Third, don't let the miracles of Jesus become mundane. Don't let the miracles of Jesus become mundane. And so when we've gotten this far in Mark, one of the common things we say is that miracles, all these crazy things, that's just what Jesus does, right? That's just what he does. He does miracles and stuff like that, and it's just we're nonchalant about it. But we can't fall into that, right? That cannot be our reaction to that. Yes, there is an element of truth to that. Jesus is God. He can do these amazing things. He does lots of amazing things. That's great. But we can't just let it roll off, and just be like, yeah, whatever, Jesus did this amazing thing again. That cannot be our reaction. Because Jesus is doing so many things through this miracle. First of all, he's changing this man's life radically, right? We can't discount that this man's life is totally changed, right? He can probably, he does not dependent on others to earn a living now, right? It's just his subjective experience is totally different because he can see So his life is changed on a personal level, right? So there's that, and there's the element that it's just defying the laws of nature. Which is just crazy, right? But also the third thing that Jesus is doing through this miracle is he is affirming that he is the Messiah. He is the sent one of God to come save his people. Right? And so sometimes we can just gloss over it as an amazing thing, and we forget the background element that Jesus is showing us an element of his identity, that he is the sent one of God come to save us. And there's many places we see this in the Old Testament. But today, I think it'd be helpful to go to Isaiah 29, which is where there's a prophecy about who Jesus is in it. And so this is what Isaiah 29 says. It says, "Therefore, behold, I will again do wonderful things with this people, with wonder upon wonder. And the wisdom of the wise men shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning men shall be hidden. Ah, you who hide deep from the Lord, ye your counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us? Who knows us? You turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay, that the thing made should say to its maker, he did not make me? Or the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding? Is it not yet a very little while until Lebanon should be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be regarded as a forest? In that day, the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. For the ruthless shall come to nothing, and the scoffer cease, and all who watch to do evil shall be cut off, who by a word make a man out to be an offender, and lay a snare for him who reproves in the gate, and who an empty plea turn aside him who is in the right. Therefore, thus says the Lord, who redeemed Abraham concerning the house of Jacob, Jacob shall no more be ashamed, no more shall his face grow pale. For when he sees his children, the work of my hands in his midst, they will sanctify my name. They will sanctify the Holy One of God, and will stand in awe of the God of Israel." And so Isaiah 29 reminds us that one of the things that the one who is coming to save the people of Israel will do is he will open the ears of the deaf. He will open the eyes of the blind. And this will be a work in their midst, creating a people for himself. And so today, what we have in our Mark 8 passage is Jesus fulfilling this, showing us who he is through this miracle. So it's not just another person being healed, as if we could even say that, right? But it's also Jesus saying, I am the Messiah. I have come to save you. Trust in me. Believe in me, right? And I think this is something we see in our own lives. It's not just about how we read Mark, but it's also something that we tend to do as well. We tend to overlook the miracles that happen in our life, right? The things that God does, the answered prayers that are in our life. We tend to forget those things so easily, right? And I just even think about like this past year at Easter, seeing 8 people share how God has radically transformed their life. That's an amazing thing, and it can be so easy to forget about how God has changed those people's lives. Right? That's a miracle. Right? And we can be like the disciples who just let these miracles just roll off our back and forget about them. And just as an example of someone I've seen do this really well is last time I was in Kansas City for one of my seminary classes, one of my professors, what he would do to kind of be intentional about this is that he would write down his prayer requests in a journal. And then when God answers that prayer request, he'd write that down next to it and assign a number to it. And then there's a number on a rock that he puts in a jar, okay? And so whenever he feels like he's going through suffering, going through a hard time, or he just wants to remember something God has done, he just pulls one of those rocks and reads about an answered prayer in his life, okay? And his wife have done this for like 20 years. So there are hundreds and hundreds. I'm not joking. I think they're on like 600 something rocks that they've seen God answer their prayers. And that's just a great reminder of intentionally remembering the amazing things God has done in our lives. Because we're so apt to forget how God has changed us, how God has answered our prayers, and the amazing everyday things that God does in our lives. So we need to be intentional about remembering it and not letting it be mundane. Again, you don't have to do exactly that, but find something that works for you to remember what God has done in your lives. Don't let the amazing things become mundane. So as we go, let us remember to behold the beauty of our God and to praise him for how he has saved us through his amazing work of the gospel. Let's pray. Jesus, we love you and we are thankful for who you are. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for loving us. And thank you for bearing with us when we are like the disciples or we are like Herod or we are like the Pharisees. Thank you for your patience that even when we don't get it, when we don't see the full picture of what you're doing and we're being stubborn, that you still love us, you're patient with us, and you still teach us who you really are. So thank you for that. I pray that as a church, we would see more of your glory and more of your beauty every day, and that we would really have the prize of our faith be an eternity beholding your glory, your beauty, and your goodness. So I just pray that that would be our prize. Yes, other things that come with our faith are great, but that you are ultimately our prize, Jesus. And we praise you for that and how you have saved us through your amazing work of dying for us. So we thank you for that, Jesus, and we lift this up in your name. Amen.